All right, hello, folks. So, second topic this week is government and the economy. Throughout this course, we've spoke about specific interventions that government may make, the proper role of the government in managing the macroeconomy, things like that. I just want to take this lecture to go a little more kind of higher level, talk about kind of theories of the state and the roles, the ideas about the appropriate role of the state kind of in society as a whole. And then, kind of as a second topic, we're going to talk about lobbying and the market or influence. Or maybe it's not so much of a market, but we'll get more into that as we go along. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the role of the state. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what governments actually do, but as I mentioned, we've kind of already covered that, so I won't spend a ton of time. And then finally, we're going to close with lobbying, because I think it's a really, really important topic. All right, so we can kind of think about the role of the state in economic life on a spectrum, where on one end you've got a kind of libertarian view. This idea leaves the state only an extraordinarily limited role in economic life. Kind of in between there and full state control is the market failure position, where the belief is that markets do a pretty good job most of the time. Sometimes they fail, and whenever they do fail, that provides a legitimate reason for the state to step in and correct that market failure. And finally, there's what I would call the radical position that would place no limits on, no or very few limits on the role the state may play in economic life. It's important to note that this kind of spectrum is independent from kind of more social, personal freedom kind of arguments. We're talking about economic life, not kind of this other axis. So, let's start with kind of the extreme non-interventionalist position, this libertarianism. So this idea is based in the concept that people engage in some sort of social contract, and this social contract means that they give up some measure of their freedoms to protect those freedoms that remain. It's kind of based on this idea of the Hobbesian individual, where people are kind of brutish and murderous, and so we need to all give up our freedom to murder each other so that we can protect our property rights, for instance. And the supporters of this will readily admit that it's kind of based in a fictionalized history. It's based in this idea of kind of natural philosophy that was really common around the kind of mid to late 1700s that is also where we get Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. So this fictional history kind of imagines a world of isolated, primitive individuals that then begin to contract with one another until they form something like a society, which there's no evidence that anything like this occurred. People have always been kind of sunken in social connection in society because we're social creatures. In the earliest stages, this was some sort of extended family unit, and today it extends to the whole of society. So, in this perspective, let's kind of talk about in practical terms what these people think the state should be doing. Well, they think the state should basically set the rules for the game. They should provide law and order. They should provide for national defense and infrastructure. Basically, all things that enable the economic activity of individuals. So this is kind of, as I mentioned, the most extreme position, and it, as such, has never really been implemented anywhere. Kind of stepping from that, we have the market failures position. So sometimes markets fail to produce sufficient outcomes. We've talked about many instances when that's the case throughout this course. And the state should intervene to correct these failures. And so the legitimate role of the state would be in providing public goods that will be undersupplied by the market, helping to fix instances of imperfect competition, where maybe there are kind of three responses there. You can regulate the behavior of the powerful firms, you can break them up, or you can nationalize them to make them a kind of public entity. And so the idea here is that if you've got and this kind of eliminates the dead weight loss that we are all familiar with that in that kind of consumer and producer surplus diagram. I think I've already drawn that a few times in this course. So just to provide some examples, one of the responses is to regulate the behavior of large firms to prevent them from holding down output and holding prices up. And this was the strategy that the U.S. Pursued with large firms like Bell Telephone, which basically controlled the whole, by and large, the whole phone network of the United States, but it was a fully private firm. Later on, their approach changed. They broke up Bell Telephone into the baby bells. And so this is another response to break it up to generate more competition. And finally, you could just straight up nationalize a firm, make it a public entity. And so this would be an example of kind of the UK nationalizing their health system, or many OPEC countries have nationalized their oil companies. So these provide another stream of funding for the state. And so these are all useful in different contexts, but that's more for an antitrust class than a current economic problems class. And then finally, another legitimate role of the state is, in this view, is to intervene in the case of externalities. So if you've got pollution, if you've got kind of positive externalities that we talked about with like the housing investment, these would all both be instances where it's like, okay, the state should maybe be able to intervene there. And there's a whole spectrum of people that are in this kind of market failure framework that are more interventionist or less interventionist. So this is kind of a very broad tint. But because it sits in the middle, it can be critiqued from either side. I didn't put a lot of emphasis on the radical argument because it was not in your readings, but that idea would be like basically central planning, so something akin to what the USSR was doing during some points in its history. So we can criticize the market failure position kind of from both the market liberal side, the libertarian side, and from the radical side. From the market liberal side, they argue that even if markets fail, the state could fail worse than markets. I think that that's more an empirical question than anything, and it does seem that like the state does a good job at a whole host of activities. The argument from that position that I find somewhat more compelling is the monopoly profits argument. So they argue that the reason people innovate is because they want to get monopoly profits. And I think that this really bears out in the history of things. So, for instance, going back to Bell Telephone, they were able, because they were a large firm that could be fairly certain they were going to exist for decades to come, they could engage in a lot of research that other firms couldn't do because they couldn't be assured that they'd continue to be profitable. And so we ended up with things from Bell Labs that were like discovering the cosmic background radiation, transistors, all of these sorts of things that we would think of as coming from like large university research came from private industry. Because they kind of had this kind of assurance that they could exist for a while as a regulated monopoly. From the radical side, we can argue that markets are systemically flawed. So they generate inequality, injustice, and instability. And so I think we've talked about a few instances in this class where kind of Minsky and his financial instability hypothesis and kind of how markets perpetuate existing inequalities absent some sort of government regulation. And so these are all things that that you could argue from this more radical position is a weakness of the market failure position. And in some instances, central planning delivers better outcomes. So, I think once again we can look towards the UK's health system as a centrally planned system that does a really good job of delivering good outcomes, and so at a low cost, which is often kind of a cited weakness of central planning, is that costs will go crazy because nobody is incentivized to economize over anything because they're not paying real prices. But that doesn't seem to bear out in reality, at least not all the time. And so I didn't want to really kind of persuade you to select one of these kind of three positions, just to kind of give you an idea of what people think about the role of the state as it relates to economics. So there are some lessons here that you can think about whenever you're, wherever you put yourself on that spectrum, if you put yourself on that spectrum. So even if we aren't libertarians, we need to be mindful that governments can fail to do a good job, and so policy should be carefully designed. If we're on a kind of more libertarian stance, well, then maybe we should be thinking a little more critically about why markets do good jobs and maybe instances where they don't do good jobs, which kind of the most strongest libertarian position wouldn't even concede that. So what I personally draw from this is that market and non-market decision-making are both necessary in different contexts, but it's impossible to objectively draw a line between where markets and government control should be. And it's also important to think about how, as this line has shifted over human history, often big shifts in this line have come with major social progress. The choice of occupation was once decided by custom and the governing structure of feudalism, and whenever that was shifted into the market, I think we can agree that, it's nice to not all be peasants. Choice of habitation. This is another thing that I think is a little more arguable if it was social progress or not, but it's another instance where that line is moved. Definitely taking, human lives out of the market was social progress, getting rid of slavery. Organs, we've collectively decided in most countries to not have markets for human organs because this creates kind of perverse incentives. And so this is another kind of stark line. But also, once again, kind of return to this more progressive stance, taking health outside of the market seems to be a good idea, or has at least done well for many other countries. We've taken ideas out of the market by providing patent monopolies, and in the future, and in some instances already currently, taking pollution out of pure market control. And so these are all things that are examples of where we decide to draw that line has implications on kind of our social lives. And as I've already mentioned, governments seem to do a pretty good job. They do a lot of things. They run state-owned enterprises, law, regulation, redistribution, social support, and promoting the culture. All of these things. And they do a lot of these things really well. It's also vital to think about the size of government. I think this is something that rhetorically is spoke about a lot, but we don't really get like a strong picture of it. Governments are big. In some countries, they can make up over half of GDP. Even in small developing countries, they're around 15%, so not insubstantial even in that context where they aren't so big. And governments have continually gotten larger as markets have gotten larger in scope. Now, I think it's impossible to argue which direction that causality goes. Does larger markets lead to larger government, or does larger government lead to larger markets? I'm not sure. But it's clear that they kind of co-evolve together. And it makes sense that if you've got a larger market, you would need a larger governing structure to provide the rules and regulations on which that market rests, and the infrastructure on which that market rests. Another position would be that as markets get larger, they generate large powers, market powers, and you need large governments to kind of be able to push back against these large powers and keep them in check. And so it's this idea that if the government were kept very small, it couldn't effectively administer justice. This is, once again, kind of theoretical role of the state stuff. But just by virtue of the government being big, it has power, is kind of the point I want to drive at here. And in very, very concrete ways, if it's big, it buys a lot of things and employs a lot of people. And so that's how governments can influence macro policy, through being a demander of last resort. Also through monetary policy, but that's kind of not so much directly related to size. Another way that large governments have power is that they get to set norms. So, for instance, federal contractors are required to have certain labor policies. I believe they, at this stage, have to also have, measure gender wage gap, and it can't be outside of certain bounds, $15 an hour minimum wage, and many things like that. And so if you want federal contracts, you've got to make these changes to the way you relate to your laborers. And so this is one way that the federal government has instituted these norms without passing laws that govern the whole economy. So moving from that discussion on to this lobbying discussion, which is kind of a whole different beast. We can think about this as kind of when things go wrong. Whenever large powers in the market space are able to marshal that market power into political power. And then they can use that political power to generate more power in the marketplace. And it kind of creates this vicious cycle. In the reading I had to read, there's a lot of talk about campaign spending, right? So campaign spending and lobbying have created a gift economy that influences policy in this kind of self-reinforcing way. Demand for campaign cash rose as Congress became more contested. That was kind of this thing where, between FDR and Reagan, the Congress was a Democratic Congress most of that time period. And so most seats were safe. And so there wasn't a great need for a large amount of campaign spending on Republican or Democrat sides. And then when LBJ decided to support civil rights, that kind of alienated the Southern Democrats from the Democratic Party, which then made Congress in play, so to speak, and then campaign spending exploded. Technology also played a role because there were more kind of buckets to dump campaign cash into, right? People weren't buying TV ads back in, the 50s. So this ends up with candidates and Congress people spending more and more time devoted to raising campaign cash. But this also changed the policies of the parties. The platforms kind of got closer in one way and further away in others. So in economic terms, the Democrats and the Republicans became much more pro-business because businesses donate money. And then on the social aspect, the platforms became divergent, right? The Republicans became extremely socially conservative, and the Democrats, while becoming more pro-business, became more socially progressive. And they did this because both of these changes in platforms support fundraising, because it's the single-issue voters that you're appealing to with these extreme platforms that will donate money. And then businesses, of course, that want to keep business as usual. They want pro-business policies. So, how do lobbyists fit into this? So, for those of you who aren't familiar, lobbyists are individuals that are hired by some firm, and that what they're hired to do is to go and speak to Congress people. And they play they're very integral to the way the legislative process occurs today, because many Congress people do not have staffs substantial enough to do adequate research on all issues. And so lobbyists kind of, in a way, get to sell themselves as experts on issues that Congress people couldn't afford to employ otherwise. So these lobbyists are advising legislators on policy, but they're doing so in accordance with the interests of their employers. And they're often the ones that are actually writing the language that becomes legislation. If those entities were paying Congress people directly, then that would be quid pro quo and a bribe and illegal. But with lobbyists as the go-between, there's not saying, oh, we're paying you for this vote. It's like, oh, this lobbyist is going to take you out to lunch. They're going to help fundraise for you whenever the next election goes around. And all you have to do is sit and listen as a congressperson. And so it's kind of distanced the relationship between the interested firm and the congressperson, and made things all kind of informal and looser. So it's not saying, I'm going to give you $5,000, you vote in this way. It's saying, hey, I'm going to give you a gift. And a gift, if you've done any reading on gift economies, a gift isn't a gift. A gift is a relationship. If I give you a valuable gift, that binds us together socially. We may not say, all right, you need to give me a gift that's worth exactly as much, but you know you're, in a sense, socially indebted to me. And that necessitates, in terms of social proprietary, reciprocation, another gift. And a lot of cognitive psych researchers on that these legislators may not even be consciously aware of the biases that are occurring. They just feel the social onus of having been given a gift of fundraising. And so this is kind of how this functions. It's not a market in the sense of, apples and oranges. It is a dense set of loose relationships based on this reciprocal gift exchange. And lobbying works. Firms that lobby are more likely to avoid regulation, so they have regulations enforced against them many months after they began violating those regulations. Universities with lobbyists receive more funding. Lobbying has just an absurd return on investment. I believe the specific figures are in the Lessig reading, but they're just ridiculous. These gains are huge, and this lobbying industry has grown. It's become a massive part of DC. And finally, the highest profit rate industries spend the most on lobbying. These would be things like health, finance, insurance, and real estate. You could argue that there's some reverse causality here, that high profits cause high lobbying, not lobbying cause high profits. So that's also something to keep in mind. But there is a relationship. There's a correlation at the very least. Legislators may also have other motives going on in this. They may want to help foster those relationships with lobbyists because they may be eyeing that job for whenever they're done being in Congress. And so the decisions of the legislators may reflect their desire to gain these highly lucrative employments after they lose their seat. It's also important to note that the politicians are kind of stuck in this. It's a prisoner's dilemma. If any individual opts out of this lobbying kind of gift economy, they will be disadvantaged whenever elections roll around because they will have fewer campaign funds, but also they won't have the same power to write legislation as quickly as legislators that use lobbyists, because lobbyists are often writing the bills and are often, interested but experts in those fields. And so in this way, a term that's often used is legislative subsidy, that lobbyists subsidize the activities of legislatures. So no one can really opt out of this, because the moment they opt out, they're at a disadvantage. So, wrapping things up. The role of government in economic life is contested. The government seems to do some things well, but maybe not all things. Those on the market liberal side ought to be wary of market failures, and those on the radical side should note when government solutions don't work well. Lobbying influences policy through an elaborate system of reputation and gift. It's not direct quid pro quo bribery like the days of old. And finally, as long as politicians need to spend a huge amount of their time raising campaign funds, anybody that is able to get them a bunch of campaign funds, like a lobbyist, is going to have influence. And so if we truly want to not have these kind of private interests really influencing the behavior of legislatures, we should probably consider public funding or some alternative funding solution that means that legislators won't be spending as much time as much of their lives gathering campaign funds. All right. Well, thank you much, and just one more lecture left.